We approached Earth for repairs. They rebuilt us, armed us, and won the war. The ship was dying. I knew it the way you know a wound has gone deep, not from the sound, not from the readings, but from the silence where the readings used to be. 3 consoles dark, the drive core making a low, grinding hum that my species has no word for because we were never supposed to hear it and survive long enough to describe it. I was sitting in the command chair with a damage report in one hand and the cold, simple fact of our situation in the other. We were drifting. 41 days from the nearest Vorath station, 11 days of life support remaining, 9 of us left on a ship built for 40. I did not think about the other 31. I made a list instead. Hull breaches, 4, 2 sealed, 2 managed. Drive core, non-functional. Secondary propulsion, 30%. Weapons, gone. Communications, partial, short range only, except for the emergency band, which still worked because emergency bands are built to outlast everything else. They are built to be the last voice a ship has. We were using ours. I am Keth Vaughn, senior engineer of the Vorath vessel Unbroken Theorem. I had served on this ship for 9 of what humans would call years, and I had never once thought I would be the one making decisions in the command chair. The commander's chair. The chair that belonged to someone else, who was no longer here, because I made a decision 3 weeks ago that command did not authorize, and I would make it again, and I will not talk about it further than that. My crew, the 9 who remained, were not panicking. Vorath do not panic. We calculate. We assess. We find the most logical path forward and we walk it, even when the path ends at a wall. The wall, in our case, was a minor spiral arm system catalogued as low interest. No Vorath installations. No allied species within range. No tactical significance. Just a yellow star and 8 planets, and one of them, the third one, blue and white and very busy looking from this distance, tagged in our database with 4 sentences. 4 sentences. I read them 3 times. Class M. Pre-interstellar. Hostile atmosphere events common. No tactical significance. Ven Saul, my navigation officer, floated the idea first. She said it quietly, the way Vorath say things they expect to be rejected. The third planet has a populated surface. They have radio transmission capability. We are within their detection range. I said nothing. She said they are pre-interstellar. The protocol does not recommend. The protocol, I said, was written by people who had other options. Silence. The drive core hummed its wrong hum. Rendall, who handled communications and who was, at that moment, eating a compressed nutrient block with the focused concentration of someone trying very hard not to think about anything, looked up. You want to send a distress signal to a pre-interstellar civilization. I want us to not die. Those 2 things may not be compatible. They are more compatible than the alternative. More silence. The ship listed slightly to port because the stabilizers on that side had been running at 1/3 power for 6 days, and no one had fixed them because we had been busy not dying. The emergency lighting gave everything a dull orange quality that I had stopped noticing after the first 48 hours, the same way you stop noticing the smell of a room you sleep in. You adapt. Vorath are efficient at adaptation. What we are not efficient at, it turns out, is asking for help. We are a species of engineers. We fix things. We do not like the period of time before the fix, the period in which the problem is still a problem and the solution is not yet visible. We find that period distressing in a way that compounds quietly, building pressure without expression, until the only outward sign is a slight increase in the precision of our language. The more precise I become, the more frightened I am. By day 11, my damage reports were the most accurate documents I had ever produced. Every measurement triple verified. Every projection bracketed with error margins that left nothing to assumption. The report said 11 days of life support. What the report did not say, because I did not include it, was that 11 days was the optimistic figure. That was if we rationed, if we reduced crew movement. If we kept the temperature in most of the ship below what Voreth physiology prefers, which is why old Yor, who had been on this vessel longer than anyone else, and who had earned certain privileges through sheer persistence, had claimed the maintenance corridor. It was the only room where the heating conduit ran close enough to the wall to make a difference. He was asleep there when I sent the signal. I sent it because the math was simple. We die here, certain. We risk embarrassment there, possible. I prefer possible over certain. I have always preferred possible over certain. It is, I think, the only belief I have held consistently across my entire career, and it has gotten me in trouble with command more than once, and I have never once regretted it. I sent the signal and then I sat back and I waited and I counted my crew because counting them was the only thing that steadied me. Vensal, Rendal, the 2 engineers Kas and Prith, the medic Tavel, the 3 others, Lunav, Save, and old Yor in his warm corridor. 9. I counted them again. 9. The response came in 47 minutes. 47 minutes. We had been drifting in this system for 11 days. We had been visible to this planet's instruments almost certainly for at least 6 of those days. Their scanning technology was primitive but persistent, like a hand feeling along a dark wall, patient and thorough. They had almost certainly seen us. They had been watching us drift and failing, and doing nothing about it because they had no context for what we were. And without context, most species do nothing, because doing nothing is safe and doing something is complicated. The response came in 47 minutes. Not in a formal language. Not with protocol headers or species identification or any of the 17 standard first contact procedures outlined in Voreth regulations. A sound file, unencrypted, human voice, direct and unhesitating, like the speaker had not paused for a single moment between hearing our signal and opening their mouth to answer it. Like the answer was already there waiting, and the only delay was the speed of light. Copy that. We are reading your position and we are coming. Hang tight. I ran the phrase through 3 translation matrices. Hang tight. All 3 matrices returned the same result, affectionate command to remain stationary. I remained stationary. There was not much else I could do, but I kept the phrase open on my console and I read it again, and something about it, the casualness of it, the complete absence of hesitation, the way it assumed without asking that of course they were coming. Why would they not come? Someone needed help and they had a ship, and that was simply the end of the calculation, settled something in me that I had not known was unsettled. Rendal was staring at me. They said they are coming. Yes. A pre-interstellar species said they are coming to assist a Voreth vessel. Yes. That is, he stopped. He looked at the nutrient block in his hand. He looked back at me. That is not what I expected. It was not what any of us expected. Tavel, our medic, came to the bridge from the medical bay where she had been running her 3rd round of checks on the supplies, a habit she had developed over the past week, cataloging what we had the way you count coins when you are not sure if you have enough. She heard the exchange. She pulled up the audio file on her own console and listened to it twice. Then she said, very carefully, "They did not ask what we were." "No," I said. "They did not ask if we were dangerous." "No." She thought about this. "They simply decided to come." "Yes." She went back to the medical bay. I heard her running inventory again, but the pace was different this time. Faster, like she was doing it to keep her hands busy, while her mind was somewhere else. What happened next was 5 days of waiting, because the humans were traveling from their planet in a vessel that our long-range scanner, once Kas managed to coax it back to partial function by cannibalizing 2 non-essential systems and a storage array that Prith was furious about, identified with some uncertainty. The scanner had categories for ship classification. This vessel fit several categories simultaneously and also did not cleanly fit any of them. The hull was asymmetrical. The plating showed visible seam lines where sections had been joined. not grown or cast or precision formed, but joined, welded together the way you join things when you do not have time to do them perfectly, and have decided that good enough moving is better than perfect waiting. The propulsion signature was inconsistent in a way that suggested the engine had been modified, possibly more than once, possibly by someone who was still experimenting while the ship was in motion. Vensal looked at the scan results for a long time. Is it spaceworthy? It is in space, I said. It is moving. That is not the same thing. No, but here they come. On day 3 of waiting, Koss came to me with a revised projection on the life support. The revised projection was not better than the original. It was, in fact, 9 hours shorter, because one of the oxygen recyclers had developed a slow failure that had been hiding inside normal variance readings until it was no longer hiding. 9 hours shorter meant we had 2 days of comfortable margin before we needed the humans to arrive. They arrived on day 5. Koss spent those 2 days of margin pretending he had not told me about the 9 hours, and I spent them pretending I had not been told, and we both spent them working on every other system on the ship, because working was the only thing that felt better than waiting. Prith and I rebuilt the tertiary scanner coupling by hand, which took 14 hours and produced a scanner that was 60% as good as the original and 100% better than nothing. Lunav rewired 2 of the dark consoles on the bridge. Save repressurized the port corridor, which meant we had access to 3 compartments we had been treating as dead space for a week. They arrived on day 5 and docked on a wire. I watched the docking arm extend on the external camera. It was attached to their hull at 4 points. 2 of those points used what my scanner identified as standard mechanical coupling. The other 2 used wire, electrical wire, the kind rated for internal wiring work in low-power systems, not for the stress loads of a docking procedure in the microgravitational variance of open space. It held. Rendal made a sound I had never heard from a Voreth before. It was not quite disbelief, and not quite amusement, and not quite relief. It was a sound that did not have a Voreth word for it, which was beginning to feel like a pattern. 7 humans came through the airlock. They came through talking, all 7 of them in the overlapping, simultaneous fashion that I would come to recognize as their default mode of operation, not interrupting each other exactly, but not waiting either, building conversation the way they built things, multiple threads running at once, each person tracking their own line while listening to the others with half their attention, the way a musician listens to the other instruments while playing their own part. My translator was working hard. English, it said, with regional variations across the 7 voices. It flagged 3 phrases as contextually ambiguous, and one as culturally specific to a degree that required additional data. The culturally specific phrase was from the woman in the burned jacket. She was the first one through the airlock, and she was already looking at the walls before she was fully through, and what she said while looking at the walls was, "Right, let's see what we are working with then." Her name was Dara. She told me this while still looking at the ceiling. She did not look at me when she said it, which I initially processed as discourtesy and later understood was simply focus. She was already working, and the work had begun the moment she stepped through the airlock, and social acknowledgement was happening in parallel with assessment rather than before it. The burn marks on her jacket were, I would learn, an occupational feature. She had been doing this work, salvage, repair, reconstruction, for long enough that the marks were a record rather than a warning. Each one meant something had gone wrong and she had been close enough to fix it. You do not get marks like that from safe distance. She took the damage report from me without asking for it, read it while walking, did not slow down. The other 6 spread through the ship. A young man named Owen was eating something, a small wrapped package, something that smelled like salt and grain, and examining the secondary propulsion housing at the same time, running his free hand along the housing while the other held the food. humming a melody I did not recognize under his breath. A compact, quiet man named Callum went directly to the communications array without being directed, opened the panel, and spent 40 seconds looking at the interior before closing it again and moving to the power routing junction instead. Two women, who introduced themselves later as Priya and Bate, were in the corridor outside the engineering bay having a rapid, technical conversation that my translator was struggling with because they were both talking at the same time and neither of them seemed to notice. The seventh human, an older man named Arthur, walked slowly and said nothing. He looked at everything with the particular attention of someone who has repaired enough things to know that what you see first is rarely the actual problem. He stopped outside the core room doorway and stood there, and I watched him, and his face changed, very slightly, the way a reader's face changes when a sentence surprises them, and then he moved on. Dara stopped at the drive core room. She stood in the doorway, looked at the core. It was 3 times her height. It was producing the wrong hum. It had been producing the wrong hum for 6 days, and 2 of our best engineers had spent those 6 days explaining to me, in careful and accurate language, exactly why it could not be repaired without replacement components or a controlled environment rebuild process that required facilities we did not have. She said, "Oh, this is just a cracked manifold housing." I explained that it was not just a cracked manifold housing. The primary resonance chamber had lost structural cohesion along the eastern seam due to thermal stress accumulation over a period that predated the original incident, and the cracked housing was a visible symptom of a deeper material failure that required. "Yeah, I see that." She walked in, around the core, touched it in 3 places, deliberate and unhurried, the same way she had touched the corridor walls. "Do you have anything that runs hot? Plasma torch, thermal welder, anything above 2000 degrees. I explained why a plasma torch was not a viable remediation tool for a material cohesion failure in a resonance chamber that had already experienced thermal stress, because applying additional thermal energy to a compromised seam without precise pressure compensation would. "Do you have a plasma torch?" I gave her the plasma torch. She caught it without looking. Koss made the same sound Rendall had made. I was beginning to think that sound was a Voreth response to situations our language had not yet built vocabulary for. They worked for 11 hours without stopping. Not without talking, they never stopped talking. They talked while they worked, around and through each other, a constant low-frequency exchange of information and assessment and occasional disagreement and more occasional laughter, and the laughter I found particularly difficult to categorize because it did not seem to interrupt the work. It existed alongside the work the way the humming existed alongside Owen's examination of the propulsion housing. A parallel process, running concurrent, not competing. The plan changed 4 times. Dara announced each change the way she announced everything, without preamble, without apology, with the simple confidence of someone who treats a changed plan as information rather than failure. The others adjusted each time without discussion, which suggested they shared her understanding of what a plan was for. A plan was not a commitment. It was the best available model of a solution, subject to revision the moment better information arrived. At hour 4, Callum dropped a calibration rod. It bounced off the drive core housing and skidded under a conduit panel. He said something brief and vivid that my translator chose to render conservatively, and then he laughed, and Owen laughed from the other side of the core, and they spent exactly 40 seconds finding the rod, and then they were back in their respective positions, mid-conversation, as if the 40 seconds had not happened. I filed this in the observation log I had started without consciously deciding to start it. In a section I labeled behavioral notes. Under a subheading I could not immediately title because I did not have a concept that covered laughter as uninterrupted workflow. At hour 7, Vensal came to stand beside me in the core room doorway. She watched Dara and Arthur working on the upper manifold section, which they had accessed by building a standing platform from 2 equipment crates and a length of conduit that Priya had found in the maintenance storage and brought without being asked. Vensal said quietly, "They are going to fix it." "It appears so." "I did not think they were going to fix it." "No." A pause, "The one with the burn marks. She has not stopped moving since she came aboard." "Dara. She touches everything before she fixes it." "I noticed. It looks like something other than diagnostics." I did not answer because I did not yet have the right answer. It would come to me later, much later, in the middle of a different crisis entirely, when I finally understood that for Dara, touching a thing before fixing it was the same as learning its name. She was not running scans. She was introducing herself. At hour 9 she sat down. Not at a workstation. Not near the core. She sat down on the floor of the corridor just outside the core room, back against the wall, legs stretched out, and she did not reach for a tool or a scanner or a comm unit. She sat and she looked at the opposite wall and she breathed, and then she said without looking at me, "You lost people." Not a question. I said nothing. She nodded once, precisely as if I had answered. 4 seconds, 5, 6. She stood up and went back into the core room. I stood in the corridor afterward, alone, listening to the drive core's changed hum, not right yet, but different from wrong, something that Cass had described as movement in the correct direction, which was the most hopeful thing any of us had said in 11 days. The ship still listed to port. Old Yor was still asleep in his corridor. Tavel was in the medical bay, not running inventory anymore, just sitting, which for Tavel was the equivalent of anyone else pacing a room. I thought about what Dara had said. I thought about what she had not said. I thought about the fact that she had sat down specifically to say it, specifically to me, specifically outside that room, and had then gotten up and gone back to work, which meant it was not an opening for a conversation. It was a door she had walked up to, knocked on, and left open. She was not asking me to talk about it. She was telling me she already knew, and that knowing it was her business and not just mine, and that she was going to keep fixing my ship anyway. The drive came back online at 3 in the morning, ship time. Every remaining console on the bridge lit up at once. The sound they made was the right sound, the operational hum, the normal frequency of a working drive core, a sound so familiar and so absent for 6 days that Vensal, who was on watch, pressed her palm flat to the nearest panel and stood very still with her eyes closed. I arrived on the bridge 30 seconds later. I stood next to her. She did not move her hand. I did not ask her to. Dara was in the doorway, jacket more burned than before, a new package of something in her hand, eating with the comfortable routine of someone who eats wherever they happen to be standing. She looked at the lit consoles. She looked at Vensal's hand on the panel. She said nothing. She nodded once, the way she had nodded in the corridor when I had not answered. Like she heard the real answer anyway. "Thank you," I said. She made a gesture I had seen 3 times now, a lift and drop of one shoulder, brief and without drama. It was not dismissiveness. It was closer to, of course. What else would we have done? Someone asked for help. We said yes. This is simply what yes looks like when it is finished. She was still eating something. I went to the command chair, updated the damage report. Drive core operational. Secondary propulsion 62% and climbing. Hull breaches managed. Life support stable. Communications full range restored. Weapons still gone. I closed the damage report, opened a new file, not a report, something else. I wrote at the top, "What do humans do when you ask them for help?" Then I sat back and I looked at the lit consoles and I thought about 47 minutes and plasma torches, and wire on a docking arm and a woman sitting down in a corridor to tell me, without any words I could file as data, that my loss was witnessed. 4 sentences had told me There was nothing here worth worrying about. I was beginning to understand that the person who wrote those 4 sentences had never looked. The next morning I filed the routine disclosure with the assembly. I want to be clear about this, it was routine. Every contact with a previously uncatalogued inhabited system required a disclosure filing. Position of the system, species classification, communication capability, developmental stage. It was administrative, required, automatic. I had filed 17 of them over my career, and none of them had ever been anything other than paperwork. I filed it while Dara's team was running diagnostics on the restored drive core, and Owen was humming in the secondary propulsion bay, and Callum was eating something that Rendall had offered him from our stores, and was examining with the specific suspicion of someone who does not know what they are eating, but has decided to eat it anyway. I did not think about who else received assembly disclosures. I should have. I had known the answer for my entire career. It simply had never been a problem I needed to care about until it was the only problem that mattered. The Krath receive all assembly disclosures. This is not a secret. It is policy, sitting in the compact the same way a splinter sits in wood, quietly, invisibly, only a problem when pressure is applied. The Krath are assembly members. They signed the compact 40 years ago. Their representative sits in the 4th Eastern seat and votes in quorum and attends formal sessions, and behaves in every measurable way like a civilization participating in galactic governance. What they do with disclosure information about pre-interstellar species is not covered by the compact. This is because the species who drafted the compact did not imagine it needed to be covered. The Krath had been members for 30 years at that point. Everyone assumed the compact meant something. The compact meant whatever the Krath decided it meant on a given day, and on this particular day, they decided it meant they had been handed coordinates. I found out when Dara's personal comm unit screamed. Not a standard alert tone. Something flat and insistent and raw, a frequency that did not negotiate with the processing centers but went directly past them, directly to the part of the mind that handles real alarm, the part that predates language and decision and everything that comes after. She was in the corridor outside the core room. I heard it from the bridge. I was moving before I had consciously decided to move, which is not something Voreth typically do, and by the time I reached her, she was already standing with the unit in her hand, looking at it. Her face was still. Not calm. I had learned the difference by then. Calm is the absence of disturbance. Still is what you become when the disturbance arrives and every part of you decides, in the same instant, not to break until you know what you are dealing with. She looked at it for 5 seconds, then at me. What is the Krath? The word sat in the air between us. I told her. I told her all of it, with the precision I use when I am afraid and the clarity I use when someone needs information, and not reassurance. I told her what the Krath did with disclosure data on pre-interstellar systems. I told her the timeline, standard approach interval, standard assessment period, standard operation window. I told her that pre-interstellar systems with no shield technology were classified as low resistance. I told her what low resistance meant in practice. I told her that the disclosure I had filed that morning had given them everything they needed. 11 weeks, approximately. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Okay." 1 word, 2 syllables, the most ordinary word in the English language, carrying in this moment the specific weight of a person who has just received the last measurement they needed before the work can start. Not acceptance, not resignation, acknowledgement, the kind that immediately becomes motion. She opened her comm and started making calls. I stood in the corridor and I listened to the drive core hum, the right hum, the fixed hum, and I thought about what I had done. I had asked for help and received it. I had filed routine paperwork. I had handed the most aggressive civilization in this region of space the exact location of the species that had come 47 minutes after a distress signal, and spent 11 hours fixing a ship they had never seen before. Around the corner, Dara's voice was already 3 calls deep, calm and rapid and specific, saying things like tonnage and we need everyone who worked on the Harlow project, and I need to speak with your admiral, yes right now, yes I understand the hour. I looked at the comm unit in my hand, the one I had filed the disclosure from. I looked at it for a long time. She came around the corner mid-sentence, 4th call now, 5th, and she looked at me the way she looked at the drive core on the first day. Reading, calculating, deciding what was actually wrong and what came next. Then she walked past me and kept talking. I started a new file on my console, not a damage report, not an observation log. At the top I wrote, 11 weeks, what happens in 11 weeks? I did not know the answer yet, but around the corner, Dara was already building it. Within the first 7 days, the calls became a network. This is the word I kept returning to, network, because it was the closest Vorath concept to what I was watching. But the Vorath version of a network is precise and hierarchical and built from the top down, authorization flowing in one direction, information flowing in the other. What Dara was building did not work like that. It was lateral and loud and self-organizing, each node connecting to the next not because someone authorized the connection, but because the connection was useful and the people on both ends could see that. 17 nations, 4 private aerospace organizations, 2 military branches. A university engineering department that Dara mentioned with a particular tone of voice that my translator flagged as affectionate, but that I came to understand meant something more like, they are difficult people who are very good when someone makes them angry, and I have made them angry. By day 10, I stopped thinking of it as a network and started thinking of it as a tide. By day 14, the first of the additional ships arrived at the orbital staging area that Dara had designated without asking anyone's permission, simply calculating where ships needed to be and telling them to go there, and not leaving any obvious conversational space for argument. I watched the ship arrive on the external scanner, then another, then 2 more. Owen was on the bridge with me. He had taken to spending parts of his off-rotation time on the bridge, sitting in the corner with whatever he was reading on a thin tablet, occasionally asking me questions about Vorath navigational conventions that were more specific and more informed than the questions of most Vorath junior officers. He looked up when the ships appeared on the scanner. "That is the Harlow group," he said, with the satisfied tone of someone watching a prediction come true. "You expected them." Dara called them on day 2. They had to come from the southern facility. It takes 12 days if you push the drive. He looked back at the tablet. They pushed the drive. I looked at the ships on the scanner, then at Owen. He was 23 years old. He had been eating something every time I saw him for 11 days, yet appeared by all measures healthy and fully operational. He read Krath tactical doctrine in his spare time. He hummed while he worked and laughed when he dropped things and had, 3 days ago, independently identified a flaw in our secondary weapons relay configuration. The relay we no longer had weapons to use, and corrected it without mentioning it to me until Koss found the correction and came to ask me if I had authorized work on that system. "Owen," I said. He looked up. "Why are you here?" He considered this. Not defensively, it was not a challenging question, it was an honest one, and he appeared to know the difference. Dara needed pilots who could read non-standard drive configurations. "I grew up on salvage ships. I can read anything." That is the practical answer. Is there another kind? There is usually another kind. He thought about it. He looked out at the ships on the scanner. Then he said, "Dara says you asked for help." We said yes. The yes has to mean something or it is not really a yes. He paused. "She says that a lot. I think she got it from someone but I do not know who." I did not have a response to that. I added it to the observation log, under a section I had titled Things I Do Not Have a Category for Yet, which had become the longest section. By the end of week 2, Dara had the Krath weapon schematics. Not to replicate them, to improve them. She put the schematics on the mess room table one evening, printed on actual paper, which I had not seen anyone use in years, because apparently Dara found physical documents easier to annotate and had no patience for the Voreth preference for holographic display, and spent 4 hours with Arthur and a woman named Priya going through them line by line, not reading them the way you read a manual, but the way you read a conversation, looking for the assumptions embedded in every design choice. The yield calculation assumes a stationary firing platform, Priya said, which means they model their targets as moving and themselves as fixed, Arthur said. So if we fire while moving, their calculation breaks. Dara circled something on the paper. But our propulsion signature will give away our position if we fire from a standard heading, unless we are already somewhere they do not expect. Which brings us back to the formation question. They talked for 4 more hours. I was in the mess room for most of it, partly because I lived on this ship and the mess room was accessible to me, and partly because I had stopped pretending I was monitoring them from a research distance. I was not monitoring them. I was learning from them. There is a meaningful difference, and it had taken me 11 days to admit it. At some point Arthur looked up and said, "Keth Vaughn, what is the Krath standard approach interval for a system they have flagged low resistance?" I told him. He nodded, wrote something on the paper. And their deviation threshold. If a system scans differently than the flagged data, how far outside expected parameters before they alter approach? I told him that too. He nodded again, did not look up. Thank you. I sat at the end of the table and watched them work through the night, and I thought about the 4-sentence database entry, and I thought about how we had filed it and moved on because it was administrative and required and routine. I thought about all the things we had measured about Earth and what we had not measured and why. We had measured capability. We had not measured will. We had measured technology. We had not measured what they would build when given a reason to build it. We had measured their stage of development and concluded, not yet dangerous, not yet significant. We had measured the locked door and called it empty. In week 3, Dara came to me with a formation plan. I say plan, but it was more than a plan. It was a document, 15 pages, with schematics and approach calculations and contingency branches for 7 different Krath response scenarios, and a detailed model of Krath targeting doctrine that was more accurate than anything in the Voreth military archive. She had built the model from 3 sources: the tactical schematics, the assembly archive records of previous Krath operations, and a series of conversations with me over the preceding days in which she had asked questions that I had answered without fully understanding what she was building from the answers. She slid it across the table in the mess room. I read it, all of it. I read it the way you read something that keeps being more than you expected, not quickly, because quickly would mean skipping, and skipping would mean missing something, and I was not going to miss something. When I finished, I looked up. "The formation uses our Voreth ships as anchor points," I said. "Your drive signatures are consistent. The Krath have encounter data on Voreth configurations. They will read you and orient to you, which means they will approach from the direction their doctrine recommends against your emission pattern." She tapped the schematic. "That direction puts them here, where 11 ships are waiting with improved close-range targeting and the ability to fire while in motion." I looked at the schematic for a moment longer. The contingency layer. On every ship that carries the modified array. If a ship takes damage to primary systems, weapons power reroutes automatically on a 2-second cycle. A damaged ship is still a firing ship. The Krath do not model for that. No, their doctrine assumes a ship is either working or it is not. She met my eyes. We disagree. Where did you learn their doctrine? She tilted her head slightly in the direction of somewhere else on the ship. Owen read it. He reads very fast. I thought about Owen in the corner of the bridge with his tablet, asking specific questions about navigational conventions. I thought about Callum and his direct route to the communications array on the first day. I thought about the way they had all moved through the ship without being directed, spreading out and assessing with the coordinated intuition of people who shared a way of seeing problems rather than a shared set of instructions. You divided the work before you came aboard, I said. We divided it before we left Earth. In 47 minutes. She looked at me steadily. We did not all come from the same place. We took a few hours to gather. But the distribution of roles. We knew what kind of ship we were going to. We knew the damage profile from your signal. We came ready to work on specific systems. She pulled the plan back across the table, began making a small annotation. We do not waste time figuring out who does what. We figure that out before we arrive, so we can start when we get there. I thought about the 47-minute response time, the wire on the docking arm, the way they had spread through the ship before anyone gave them a direction. They had not come to assess. They had come to fix. The assessment had happened between the signal and the departure, in whatever conversation happened at whatever speed humans talk when something is urgent and someone has asked for help, and the answer is already yes. The Vareth fleet arrived in week 4. 4 ships, standard rescue configuration, weapons minimal. Their communications had apparently been unusual. I was told this later by Veltor, because the coordination request had come through assembly channels but had been composed in a style that assembly communications were not typically composed in. Direct, specific, free of the formal phrasing that assembly communications typically use, the phrasing that signals importance by being elaborate. The message had simply said, "Come to these coordinates. Bring your engineers. Bring your weapons technicians. Do not bring questions you are not prepared to have answered." Dora had sent it. She had not mentioned this to me. When I found out, I asked her why she had not mentioned it. She said, "Did it work? 4 ships, full cooperation, engineers and weapons technicians as requested." "Yes," I said. "Then I do not see what there is to mention." The 4 commanders came aboard for a briefing. I gave the briefing in the command room, with Vensal beside me and Dara in the corner with the plan on the table in front of her, annotated now, revised twice since the first version, improved the way she improved everything, not out of dissatisfaction, but out of the conviction that something better was always possible, and the only crime was not looking for it. 3 of the 4 commanders looked at me the way Rendal had looked at me on day 1, when I said I wanted to send a distress signal to a pre-interstellar species. The specific expression of someone who is too disciplined to say what they are thinking, and not quite disciplined enough to hide that they are thinking it. Veltor was the 4th. He had been flying longer than any of us. He had a reputation for being difficult, and also for being the person you wanted in the room when the situation was genuinely bad, because the genuinely bad situations were the ones he prepared for, and the easy ones were the ones he found boring. He looked at the schematic for a long time, longer than the other 3 combined, and then he looked at Dara. "Who designed the contingency layer?" he asked. "I did," she said. "Bate and Priya refined the rerouting sequence." "You built a failsafe into a weapons system." "Yes." "Designed around the assumption that the ship will be damaged and still in the fight." "Yes." He looked at the schematic again, then at me. "The Krath do not build failsafes. Their combat doctrine assumes the ship is either functional or removed from the equation." "I know. They have never encountered an enemy that built for damaged states." "No." He was quiet for 10 seconds. 10 full seconds, which for Vorath is the measure of a significant calculation being completed. I watched him look at the formation plan the way Arthur had looked at the interior of the drive core on the first day. Not at what was there, but at what it meant, at what the choices embedded in the design revealed about the mind that made it. He said, "We will stay." The other three looked at him. He did not look at them. He was already studying the next page of the plan. "All ships," he said to me. "Full cooperation. Tell me about the formation anchor positioning." I told him all of it, with Dara adding specifics when I reached the sections that were more hers than mine, which was most of them. Veltor asked 12 questions. Every one was good. 3 of them were questions I had not thought to ask, and when I looked at Dara after the third one, she was writing in the margin of the plan. After the briefing, when the other 3 commanders had left to coordinate with their ships, Veltor stayed. He stood at the table and looked at the revised plan and said, without looking up, "How long have they been spacefaring?" 11 weeks, I said, approximately. He did not respond for a moment. Then, "They think differently than we do." "Yes. They do not plan for the end state. They plan for every point before the end state, including the points at which the original plan has already failed." I had not articulated it that way, but when he said it I recognized it. It was what I had been writing around in the observation log for 3 weeks, the shape I kept circling without naming. They did not commit to a plan the way Vorath committed to a plan, with precision and investment, and the assumption that the plan would hold because good plans hold. They committed to the problem, and the plan was whatever the problem required at any given moment, subject to revision without shame. "Will they fight?" Veltor asked. "They have been training for 8 days, simulations and practical drills. No real combat experience in space." "No," I thought for a moment. Dara told me the principles translate. He looked at me steadily. "What principles?" She did not specify. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when an incomplete answer is still somehow sufficient. He picked up the plan, rolled it, tucked it under his arm. "I will study this. I have notes by morning." He left. I stood at the table in the command room. Old Yor appeared in the doorway behind me, as he often did now, moving through the ship like a shadow with opinions, observing everything, commenting on almost nothing, occasionally saying something that turned out later to be the right thing at exactly the right moment. He looked at the empty table where the plan had been. "The old one," he said. He meant Veltor. "He saw it." "Yes. The rest of them will see it eventually. I hope before 11 weeks is up." Yor made a sound that was the closest thing Vorath had to a dry laugh. "It will be closer to 10, he said, and went back to his corridor. He was right. It was 10 weeks and 3 days. By the end of week 5, the ship count was 22 functional Earth vessels, 9 of them carrying the modified Krath array design, the close-range targeting improvement, and the contingency failsafe that rerouted weapons power on a 2-second cycle. By the end of week 6, it was 28, with 3 more in construction. By the end of week 8, it was 31 Earth vessels plus the 4 Vorath ships, 35 total, organized into a formation that existed in no tactical database anywhere in the assembly archive, because no one had ever built it before. The 31st Earth ship came online on a Thursday. I know the name of the day because Dara told me, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used when she said anything. Like the naming of days was information, and information was always worth having. She told me something else that day too. We were on the bridge, both of us looking at the scanner, at 31 Earth ships and 4 Vorath ships positioned in the orbital band around a planet that 4 sentences had called no tactical significance. She was drinking something hot from a container she carried with her everywhere. I had never seen the container empty. "You are thinking about the disclosure," she said. "I think about it often." "Do not," she drank from the container. The disclosure brought the Krath here. The Krath coming here brought this. She gestured at the scanner at 35 ships at 8 weeks of work. If you had not sent the disclosure, they would have found us eventually. They find everyone eventually. The difference is we had notice. She looked at me. You gave us notice. That is what the disclosure did. I had not thought of it that way. You are good at finding the other way to look at things, I said. It is the only useful skill. She went back to looking at the scanner. Everything else you can learn. 9 days later, the Krath arrived. On a Tuesday. I know this because Dara told me the name of the day, standing beside me on the bridge at 3:40 ship time, watching the scanner fill with Krath approach signatures. 14 vessels, coming out of fold space in the tight cluster that was their standard insertion pattern for low-resistance systems. Because we were classified as low-resistance. Because the disclosure had said pre-interstellar, no shields, no tactical significance. They were scanning the planet, running their standard assessment, positioning for the next phase of their operation with the unhurried efficiency of a process they had done many times before in systems that had behaved exactly as their data predicted. That was the window. All ships formation Delta, I said. 35 ships moved. Not in Vorath formation, not in Krath counterformation, in something that existed in no database, built from a principle that Krath tactical doctrine had never needed to model because no species had ever used it. Not because no species had ever thought of it, but because no species had ever committed to it, because committing to it required a specific belief about damaged ships that most species did not hold. A damaged ship is still a ship. A ship with a 2-second rerouting cycle is still a weapons platform. A species that builds contingency layers into everything does not stop at the point where their opponent's model says they should stop. They continue. They adapt. They find the next available option and use it. The Krath read our drive signatures. They identified the Vorath anchor points. They oriented their approach along the vector their doctrine recommended, the vector that put them in the corridor Dara had designated, the corridor where 11 ships were waiting with the targeting system she had improved, and the failsafe she had built from the assumption that her people would still be fighting even if they were hurting. She was right. The Krath commander sent a transmission in the 4th minute. My console rendered it. Identify the species of the non-Vorath vessels. 14 Krath ships, veterans of more operations than I was going to count, and they were asking me to identify a species because the species was not in their files. The disclosure had said pre-interstellar. The disclosure had said no tactical significance. The disclosure had told them there was nothing here worth modeling. I let the silence run 3 full seconds. Neighbors, I said. What happened in the next 11 minutes is in the official report. 30 pages. The assembly has it. I am not going to recount the tactical sequence here because the tactical sequence is not the point. The point is Harlow 3. Harlow 3 took damage in the 4th minute. Primary propulsion impacted. By Krath doctrine, that ship was removed from the engagement. By Krath doctrine, a ship without primary propulsion was no longer a variable they needed to track. The contingency layer activated. Weapons power rerouted in 2 seconds. Harlow 3 kept firing. The Krath vessel it was targeting had stopped modeling for it, had redistributed its own calculations, had moved on, and Harlow 3 was still there, still firing, and the Krath did not have time to rebuild the model. Owen was on Harlow 3. I looked this up afterward. He was fine. Callum took down the Krath command network communication relay in minute 7 using a technique he had developed 3 weeks ago and never formally documented. I asked him afterward to document it. He said he would get to it. I am still waiting. The network went partially silent, and the 14 Krath vessels lost their coordination timing. And a Krath fleet without coordination timing is a different problem from a coordinated one. More unpredictable, yes, but also more isolated, each ship making its own calculations without the shared information architecture that made them formidable. They became 14 separate decisions instead of one. The Krath withdrew at minute 11. This was intentional. Dara had been direct about this in the planning sessions, with a simplicity that had initially confused the Vorath commanders because Vorath military thinking is oriented toward decisive resolution. You engage to conclude. Dara's thinking was oriented toward cost. You do not need to conclude. You need to make the cost of continuing exceed the value of the objective. A Krath withdrawal was more useful than a Krath defeat, because a withdrawal produced a report, and a report went back to Krath Command, and Krath Command would have to read it, and what the report described was something their doctrine could not account for. 35 ships that should not exist, built in 11 weeks by a species whose database entry was 4 sentences long. A weapons system with a failsafe. A formation with no name in any archive. A damaged ship that kept fighting because the people who built it did not share the Krath assumption about what damaged meant. Let them report that. Let them bring it back and brief it to their command, and watch the command try to fit it into existing categories. Let them spend the next months rebuilding a doctrine around the fact that the database was wrong, and the assessment was wrong, and the 4 sentences were the beginning of a story, not the end of it. The last Krath vessel folded out at 3:51. Dara was at Rendal Station, where she had been running network coordination for the past 11 minutes. When the scanner cleared, she let out a breath. Long and slow, the kind that has been held since before the engagement, since before the training, since the moment she looked at a comm unit screaming a frequency she had never heard before and said okay and opened her contacts list. She turned to me, all ships reporting. 35 out of 35. She nodded, damage. Minor on 9 ships. Harlow 3 needs significant work on primary propulsion. All crews accounted for. Good. She was already pulling up Harlow 3's status on the console, already reading, already in the next phase, the repair phase, the phase where the problem has a known shape and the solution is a matter of time and work, both of which she was confident she had enough of. Owen is going to be very proud of himself, she said. Is that the right word for it? It is the exact right word. He is insufferable when he is right. She said this with the particular tone she used for Owen, which was the same as the tone she used for the university engineering department. Difficult, good when it matters, worth it. Tell him the drive relay he corrected 4 weeks ago held through the whole engagement. He will want to know. I will tell him. She was quiet for a moment, working. The bridge hummed around us, the right hum, the operational hum, 35 ships in the orbital band, and the planet below turning in its own light and the scanner clean. I almost did not send the signal, I said. She did not look up, I know. If I had not. You sent it. She made a notation on the status display. The only part of the story that matters is the part that happened. I held that. I turned it over. I thought about what it meant, coming from someone who spent every working hour planning for the parts that had not happened yet, the contingency layers, the what-ifs, the 2-second rerouting cycles for futures where things had gone wrong. She planned for every version of the story except the one where the first choice was different. The first choice was made. The first choice was yes. Everything after that was just the shape yes took. Old York came onto the bridge. He had been in the maintenance corridor, watching the engagement on the auxiliary screen, in the warmest room on the ship, which he had occupied by right of tenure and personal preference since before most of the current crew joined. He walked to the center of the bridge and he looked at the clean scanner and the 35 icons in the orbital band, and then he looked at Dara, sitting at the communications station, already composing the damage assessment, already making notes. He said nothing. He sat down in the corner. He looked at the stars. I went to the command chair. My chair. I opened the observation log, the one that was not a damage report, the one that had started as 14 pages and was now something I had stopped counting because counting it had stopped being the point. I scrolled to the bottom. I wrote one line. The signal we almost did not send changed everything. Then I opened the other file, the one that had been open for 3 years, the letter to the families of the 31 people who had left on the pods, because I made a decision that command had not authorized, and I had been right to make it, and the rightness of it had not made the weight of it any lighter. 3 sentences. I had written it and rewritten it and rebuilt it across 3 years, not because I could not find the words, but because I kept believing the way Dara believed, that something better was possible, that the right version was still ahead if I kept looking. I had found it somewhere around week 7 of the 11 weeks, in the middle of a planning session, watching Arthur trace damage on a schematic with the same deliberate touch Dara used on things she was taking responsibility for. I had found it, and known it was right the way you know when a thing is finally exactly what it needs to be. I read it once more. I sent it. Outside, 35 ships held position around a planet that 4 sentences had called no tactical significance. Earth was blue and white from here, the same as the first day, still busy looking, still full of people making calls and building things and answering distress signals in 47 minutes, because the answer was already yes before the signal finished transmitting. Vensal turned from her station. The assembly is requesting a full report. I will file it. They also want an updated database entry for Earth. I looked at the window, at the ships, at the planet, at the scanner that showed 35 icons where the database had never predicted even one. At everything that 4 sentences had failed to contain, because 4 sentences had been written by someone who measured capability and called it character, who measured what a thing was and concluded it would stay that way, who looked at a locked door and decided there was nothing behind it worth knowing. I will write it, I said. It took me 3 days. The Assembly Editorial Committee flagged the final line as non-standard. They requested a revision. I declined. The entry was filed unchanged. 4 pages. The last line reads, "Do not approach for repairs unless you are prepared for what comes next." I think about that line now. I think about it the way I have learned, slowly, against my nature, with effort that became habit and habit that became something I no longer have a word for, to think about things while I am doing something else, while the work is already moving, while the next thing is already arriving. I think about 47 minutes, about wire on a docking arm, about a plasma torch caught without looking, about a woman sitting down in a corridor to tell me, without any words I had a category for, that my loss was not invisible and the work was going to happen anyway. I think about a drive core that should not have come back online, about 35 ships that should not exist, about 11 weeks and what a species does with them when someone has handed them a reason. I think about the signal I almost did not send. Then I stopped thinking about almost. Almost did not happen. Yes happened. Yes is the only part that matters, and yes is still moving, and somewhere in the orbital band of a planet with no tactical significance, yes is still building the next thing, already beyond what I can see from here, already further along than anyone measured. I close the log. I close the damage report. I leave the observation file open, because it is never finished, because there is always more to write, because 4 sentences are never enough for something that keeps growing. Outside, the stars are the same stars they were the day we started drifting. Everything else is different.